Hello out there. I'm RG, a writer, reader, and lover of all things written word adjacent. Today specifically, that means we're talking about books. It's January, so it is the perfect time to be cuddling up on a cozy couch for an hour or two's worth of escapism with your favorite book. I thought we could spend a little bit of time today talking about the books that I read in December as a little wrap-up, as well as my plans for January and 2025 in general. I did divide the video up into timestamps in the description below, so feel free to take a look and skip around to whatever content you find the most interesting. In December, I read 5 books, which for me is pretty good. I am a slow reader generally. I like to take a lot of notes. I have a very detailed reading journal, so if I'm reading for an hour's time, I'm spending about 20 minutes taking lots of notes about what I'm reading, and that's for both the fiction and the nonfiction, which means you're not going to see any 15-book monthly wrap-up videos here. So of those 5 books, 3 were fiction, so historical fiction, dark fantasy, and sci-fi, and 2 were nonfiction, and those were both about either writing or being a writer. I should mention that when I'm summarizing the books, I'm not giving away any more information than what's written on the book jacket itself, so don't worry about spoilers on that front. The first book that I read in December was Shelley Parker Chan's She Who Became the Sun. This was a book that my best friend Chris loaned to me about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5, and I only got around to starting and finishing it this year. So my toxic trait as a reading friend is if you recommend or loan me a book, I will put off reading it until forever because I want to make sure that I am the correct frame of mind to read it and love it as much as you did in order to have recommended it to me. Which is terrible because that means I sleep on books that I should have been reading much earlier. And I did do that with 2 of the books that I read this last month, which is a real shame because I loved them both. All right, but She Who Became the Sun, Shelley Parker Chan. So this tells the story of a nameless girl who grew up in 1345 China under Mongol rule in a poverty-stricken small village where there are terrible droughts and they're constantly fighting against starvation. The girl and her brother are taken to a local fortune teller who tells them their futures, their fates, and for the brother, Zhu Chongba, the fortune teller reads a future full of greatness, whereas for the girl, the fortune teller reads nothingness. And this is absolutely intolerable for our nameless protagonist. She is profoundly upset. She's clever. She's kept herself and her family from starving for months. Why should her fate be nothingness, whereas her kind of useless older brother is destined for greatness? Then her father is killed by bandits and her brother dies of despair, and she just refuses to go along with them into the afterlife. She is meant for more than that. So she takes up her brother's identity, becomes Zhu Chongba, and then takes herself off to a monastery where she pledges to become a monk and is raised in plenty. So the story follows her as she grows up in the monastery as Zhu Chongba and until the monastery is destroyed, and then after the monastery's destruction, as she sets out into the world, determined to become Zhu Chongba so that she can take the fate that he never lived up to and finally attain greatness. So a few of my spoiler-free thoughts about the book. At line level, the writing is gorgeous. There are tons of beautiful sentences. There are thousands of quotes that you could pull out because the writing is so evocative, beautiful. It has a gorgeous rhythm to it. It uses beautiful words, very well-constructed sentences, paragraphs, and story. Shelley Parker Chan has an excellent manipulation of the language, yes, but also can really manipulate the reader very well. The author really understands what preconceptions the reader might be coming into this historical Chinese setting with and manipulates those preconceptions through the story very well in order to help us immerse ourselves into the story, as well as experience a sense of injustice on behalf of the characters, because we have, modern sensibilities that might feel like the things that they're being forced to experience or the treatment that they're forced to endure are really not something that we would consider acceptable nowadays. So the indirect characterization, the world building, the language itself, everything about this book is so engaging to the senses. It is a fantastic read. As for the characters, this book is written in close, limited third person with multiple POV characters throughout the story. There are two primary characters who tend to have most of the POV scenes. However, there are a few tertiary or secondary characters who receive their own scenes from their own perspectives, which help to flesh out the narrative. Zhu is ambitious, funny, resilient, determined. She will do anything to attain what she desires, and the desire, of course, is the greatness that she felt should have been promised to her. This is a good thing, and it's also a character flaw. It helps her to attain her goals, but at the same time, it's something that she needs to recognize within herself and sort of figure out where her limits, her ethics, and her morality lie. It's something that she tries to temper throughout the course of the novel. I did pull out one quote, which really exemplifies who Zhu Chongba is as a character for you, so I'm going to read it for you right now. Becoming nothing was the most terrifying thing she could think of, worse even than the fear of hunger or pain or any other suffering that could possibly arise from life. So she's really a character who's railing against her nothing fate and trying to take the fate of her brother into her own hands. The story progresses quickly and it gathers speed as it goes. There's a sense of weight, so there are a few characters who are facing their fates, not just the main character, and that really makes a sense of urgency or pressure present throughout the narrative. It touches on the themes of fate versus choice, personal agency, identity, gender in general, sexuality, desire, not only in the physical sense, but also in the sense of ambition, and power and war, as well as disability. It does contain a small amount of graphic sexual content. There are scenes involving war, murder, death, violence, injury, and disfiguration, and some characters express misogyny in a way that might be uncomfortable for a modern reader, but I think overall it is an absolutely fantastic read. I would give it 4 out of 5 stars on my very arbitrary star rating scale. It's a beautiful novel with gorgeous prose, compelling characters, and a story that really gets its hooks into you. In particular, I found the exploration of queer themes like gender identity, gender expression, and sexuality to be particularly compelling and fascinating. The way they were interwoven into the story events made them salient throughout the entire course of the novel, and I thought it was a very beautiful way to explore what those kinds of feelings must be like. If you like historical fiction, sweeping epics, morally gray characters, dark themes, and an exploration of queerness which happens on the page, then this book is for you. Highly recommend. Okay, now for some spoilers. Part of the reason that I keep a very detailed reading journal is that I consider myself a rather dense reader, and it takes a while for things to sort of penetrate through my thick skull. The title, She Who Became the Sun, is not only beautiful and evocative, but it is also a pun, and it took me until I had finished reading the book and was writing my reflections afterwards to realize that this is a pun. She becomes her brother, the son of the Zhu family. I should not have missed that. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed about the book was the exploration of how the fate and the body and the self all interact. So I'm going to read you one quote here. But now, belatedly, she remembered how the fortune teller had read Zhu Zhongba's fate in his pulse. His fate had been in his body, and for everything she had left behind in Zhongli, she was still in her own body, the body that had received the nothing fate, and which now saw ghostly reminders of it all around her. The corridor light reflected faintly off the golden statue and its 1,000 watching eyes. How could she have had the temerity to think she could fool heaven? I think the book does a great job of exploring this theme of, the connection between the body, the self, and the fate, and how they all interact. In particular, towards the end of the book, when she loses her arm, the way that her sort of character and personality change is really marked, and I thought that was particularly interesting because she's no longer in her original body, right? This body has been changed. That means her fate has been changed if the fate lies in the body, right? And since she has been trying so hard up until this point to become her brother, to act the way he might have acted, or, to think the way he might have thought, in order to fool heaven and try to attain his fate, now that she's no longer in a body that could be passed off for his, because he had both of his arms, the way that she sort of deviates from the structure that she had set out for herself from the beginning of the novel is really fascinating to me. Her desire to do as he would do versus her desires that surpass what he would have wanted are constantly in conflict. And it really creates a sense of inner turmoil that escalates throughout the novel in a way that I find fascinating. I really did enjoy the character relationships and dynamics with the different characters. In particular, I felt that her relationship with Ma was fascinating. I thought we could have had perhaps a little bit more of their development on page. Ma had a lot to offer Zhu, and I think that their relationship was very mutually beneficial in a lot of ways, but I would have liked to see a little bit more of a ramp up in terms of the escalation of their affections and the progression of their relationship throughout the course of the story. As for Ouyang, I really liked him as a character, but I will admit that I had a hard time reading his POV. He's a bit of a dark guy. He has a lot of anticipatory guilt and simmering resentment and unfulfilled tension and desires that he both wishes he could fulfill but also resents himself for feeling. And it was pretty heavy. I did like him a lot as a character, and in particular when he and Zhu finally joined forces at the end and they had their moment of camaraderie and saw each other as people and not just as opponents. That was, I think, the highlight of the novel for me. If I had more of that, I would have been even happier with the story than I was. Which brings me to the prospect of the sequel. From what I understand, the second book of the duology, He Who Drowned the World, explores his camaraderie and relationship with Zhu Chongba a little bit more, which means that if I ever get my hands on that book, I will absolutely be reading it. So, hard recommend, 4 stars out of 5. The missing star I would attribute solely to some of the pacing towards the end, which felt maybe a little bit rushed for my taste, but other than that, I mean, this was really a fantastic read. The second book that I read was Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody, and this is a book based on Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, which is about script writing, and it repurposes his method for script writing for writing novels. Now, this is the second time that I have read this book. I read it the first time, I'd say 2 or 3 or maybe 6 years ago, somewhere around there. And I did read and will continue to be reading a lot of writing books moving forward because I'm planning on doing a video at some point in the next couple of months about books about writing. So keep your eye out for that if you're into that. So this is a guide to novel writing that approaches storytelling from the perspective that all good stories have an underlying fundamental structure that makes them work. And by work, I mean it makes them feel satisfying for the reader, it makes them feel complete, it makes them feel engaging throughout the course of the story. Jessica Brody looks at beats as signposts on a map that direct you, in the correct direction to take in order to progress the story in a way that, again, feels satisfying. She discusses character transformations, story beats, genre conventions, and provides a nice little FAQ section at the end that helps to troubleshoot and break down the process of using the structural guide in order to address your own story. It's a quick read. You can knock out the beats section of the book throughout the course of an afternoon, I'd say, and then sort of pick your way through the genre piece and read the FAQ section at the end through the course of another afternoon. It's incredibly useful if you are new to writing and aren't used to thinking about story in terms of structure, and it gives a good framework for understanding A and B stories and how they interact, how character development works throughout the course of a novel, and how it should be supported by the events of the novel, and also what the A and B stories should accomplish over the course of the novel. It's also great for troubleshooting if you're stuck, or for planning in advance to avoid getting stuck, or for doing a little bit of both if you're somewhere in between the way that I am. Overall, I'd give this book 5 stars. So for my very arbitrary 5-star ratings for reference books, the way that I judge them is I want to assess how useful these books have been for framing my thinking about a specific topic, as well as whether or not I return to them as a guide or as a reference later on down the line. I've definitely incorporated elements of this framework into my own internal understanding of story structure, and I've gone back to the book multiple times in order to help myself think through story problems or structural issues that I'm having when I'm working on a novel. So that gives it a 5-star for me. It's quick, it's practical, very little nonsense. If you like a fluff-free book about writing, if you're a newer writer who is struggling on advancing a story and making it feel impactful, or if you are an experienced writer who's stuck and isn't sure how to fix the problem, then I would highly recommend that you pick up a copy of Save the Cat. Writes a novel. It is a very good little reference book. The next book I read was Alice by Christina Henry. This is a classic story retelling based on the works of Lewis Carroll, which is a dark fantasy set in a historical setting. It is also the first book of a 5-book series called The Chronicles of Alice. This is the only book of that series that I've read so far. So it tells you the story of Alice, a woman who is living in a mental hospital, has been there for about 10 years, and she's missing pieces of her memory. She remembers a tea party when she was younger. She remembers a rabbit with long ears, and she remembers blood and the feeling of a knife in her hands. She is friends with Hatcher, a fellow inmate of the asylum, who lives in the room next door and speaks to her through a mouse hole in the connecting wall between their rooms. One day there's a fire at the hospital, and she and Hatcher escape into the old city, which is a dangerous place full of gangs and violence, and try to find safe harbor there. But something else has escaped the hospital with them, something terrifying and dangerous, which they will have to track down, and that means going into the heart of the old city, the place that took Alice's memories from her, and finding the rabbit that has been haunting her for a decade. So, spoiler-free thoughts. As far as the writing goes, it is told in a very close third-person limited with a single POV throughout the story. It's through Alice's perspective throughout from beginning to the end. At the line level, there are some really beautiful sentences that really lean into the lyrical nature of the source material. The story doesn't always do this, which can highlight the segments that do or make them feel a little out of place. I wish that there was more of this poetic, repetitious, lyrical feel throughout the novel. When it shows up, I always had to stop and sort of reorient myself to the story because I'm trying to determine if the use of this specific narrative style and tone is indicative of something important story-wise, or if it's just like a moment where the author felt like it would enhance the ambiance of a scene. The main character, Alice, is both frustrating and somebody that you want to root for. She does have a lot of awareness about her own flaws, as well as her role in the story and how the events occurring in the story seem to be surrounding or revolving around her and Hatch. It can be almost fourth wall breaking, her sort of meta awareness of what's going on, which can be refreshing, but it can also be a little distracting. Hatch is an interesting guy. I like him a little bit. I wouldn't say that I love him. He's a good supporting character. He does have some interesting lines. He does push the story forward. And there are times where he also takes the back seat and lets Alice do her thing. So, good supporting character, not someone that I would say that I particularly stan. As for the story itself, it progresses pretty quickly. I would say maybe too quickly sometimes. I might want another 100 pages just so that I could let some of the moments that occur in the story have their time to build up a little bit more, and then to give the characters a chance to decompress from them. Particularly in the latter third of the book, I think that the pacing is fairly relentless, but in a way that's not necessarily satisfying. There is a romantic subplot, which is fairly minimal and can make it feel, again, a little unsatisfying. But I do think that it matches character states well. That said, that means that sometimes the characters are a little confused about how they're feeling, so the romantic subplot gets a little bit confusing too. It was fine. I wouldn't be reading this book for the romance, although it was nice to have a few moments like that because they brought levity to a very dark story. World building wise, there are some noticeable gaps, particularly the magic system. There are places in the story where I had to pause and sort of think about the implications of the world building so far. The old city is a very dark place. There's a lot of terrible things that happen there, almost to the point where I wonder how feasible it would be for people to live there long term and whether or not there are any moments of peace to be had. But in general, I would say that it felt immersive. Magic is one of the areas in particular where the world building falls short. It's a very prominent element of the story from the beginning to the end, but because it's not a particularly well-established system, at times it makes one wonder what the rules are and how it works, because things happen with magic that feel... I don't even know how to finish that sentence. It raises questions. It just makes you wonder, if a character can do this, then insert the blank for spoilers. The book touches on themes of personal agency, trauma and trauma recovery, treatment of and attitudes towards women, mental health, and familial relationships in the face of trauma. This is a dark fantasy, so there are a slew of content warnings to be had. They include misogyny, rape, sexual assault, violence, trafficking, enslavement, torture, murder, animal cruelty, ableism, mental health, forced institutionalization, cannibalism, classism, gang violence, and probably a lot more that I can't think of off the top of my head. Overall, I would give the book 3 stars. I think this would be a bit of a provisional rating that might go up if I were to read the book again, because I think there are a lot of themes and motifs that I would like to reread the book for. It does have some interesting story elements that I enjoyed and thought about for quite a while after I finished the book. The reason that this is a 3-star rating initially instead of a 4-star rating is because of the pacing in the latter half of the book, as well as some of the choices that were made in the conclusion. But again, this rating could go up on a second read. If you are into dark fantasy retellings of classic stories, you might enjoy this one. If you're not in the mood to be slapped in the face by the ill treatment of women by men in the world on pretty much every single page, then maybe skip it. And now, spoilers. I think the one quote that sums up the climax of the book is the line she delivers when she finally reaches the rabbit's place. It was not very impressive. I understand what the book is doing here. It's about Alice finally facing all of her fears, about her realization that she has built the rabbit up into this monstrous and terrible thing in her mind and in her memories. Not that he wasn't monstrous and terrible originally, but he's been built up a lot. It's about expectation versus reality, right? It's about taking the power out of memories. However, Dor killing the rabbit instead of Alice, while it makes sense, right? Because even though it's primarily off page, Dor suffered at the hands of the rabbit for much longer and much worse than Alice did. And because this is sort of a contrast to how the caterpillar's death should have belonged to the mermaid, but Alice took it instead, right? It's a statement that this is not Alice's revenge to mete out, because she's the main character of this story. Her suffering does not supersede the suffering of others, and they have more of a right to take that than she does. That said, the anticlimax of Alice facing off and then passively watching as Dor takes care of the rabbit, and then following that immediately with the anticlimax of the showdown with the Jabberwocky, I understand the authorial choices here. The author is really aware of this and writes it into Alice's reflections at the end very well. So here's another quote. Alice sighed. Somehow things had not quite worked out as she expected. In her mind, she would find the blade that defeated the Jabberwocky and use it to vanquish him, like that girl in the story who led all the soldiers. had thought Hatcher would be at her side, her white knight, defending her from the Jabberwocky's armies. Life is not much like stories, Alice thought. Still, her life had a giant talking rabbit in it, and she didn't think that was very common. So the author acknowledges, right, that the reader may have been robbed of a story-like ending. And I understand why that's happening, and I can appreciate what it's doing, while also acknowledging that I am a reader who does want a story-like ending, and am therefore not very satisfied by its absence. There was a lot that happened in the book, and Alice's growth felt very organic in the face of that, but the ending lacked a sense of resolve and participation for me. It didn't feel earned. I really did enjoy the language, the use of repetition, how lyrical it could be on occasion, and I would have wanted to see more of that. I think if I were to reread the book again, I would have more of an opportunity to read for the particular themes that I found interesting and the motifs that I noticed reoccurring throughout the book. So motifs like butterflies, sleep, magic, themes of madness, mental health, and trauma recovery. And I found myself reflecting on those a lot at the end, and I think that would give me a deeper appreciation of the book as a whole. I do want to show you in my reading journal, I have a whole 2-page spread dedicated to, over on this side, a whole 2-page spread dedicated to all of the themes that I would like to read more of and why. However, I don't think that I'm going to be rereading this book anytime soon. Given that this is the first book of a series, maybe some of what I wanted or hoped for from the characters in the story shows up in the following books. That said, I'm not particularly motivated to continue reading the rest of the series. I did enjoy this book on some levels. I give it 3 stars, like I said. I wouldn't say I would hard recommend it to anyone to read ever, but I found it enjoyable for the most part. I don't think I need more of this story or this version of these characters, though. So Alice is where I started the series, and that is where I will end. The next book that I read was Becoming a Writer by Dorothea Brande. This book was originally published in 1934. It's nonfiction. It's about being a writer. And Dorothea Brande was teaching creative writing classes in the 1920s, so you can expect quite a difference in terms of narrative style, authorial voice, compared to the kinds of books that we're used to reading now. The initial contention of this book is that many of the problems that writers face actually arrive before the writing begins. So these are issues of authorial character, the character of the writer, and balancing, the internal artist who is whimsical, flighty, impulsive, with the artisan who is a worksman and diligent and who has real-world responsibilities that they need to meet. She outlines a method for training the writer to develop the character traits that are supportive of the craft, and also discusses certain habits and behaviors that are either helpful or unhelpful, both for being a writer, and for the actual development of story. It's a short book, quick read. I think it has a lot of good points, things that I agree with, that it was really nice to see validated in print. But I also felt that it had a fair amount of fluff in it for a book that purports to be exercise-based and a practical guide. It raises a lot of considerations that I think are important, but these are hardly exercises. At some points, I did find the structure a little bit disorganized too, which would make it a bit harder to use as a reference on the latter end if I'm looking to find something after having read it once. Because of the organization, I might not be able to find it easily. That said, it was a good book for introspecting about myself and my habits as a writer and my character strengths and shortcomings, and for getting me started thinking about how I could improve those shortcomings inside of myself. The writing of the book at the line level is delightful, very much a product of its time, and the narrative voice and the written style. I would give this book a provisional 3-star rating overall. I do think that it is having an impact on my conception of what being a writer is, but I'm not certain that it is a book that I will return to periodically for re-examination. I think this is one where you sort of internalize it once and then maybe you're done with it. Either way, I do think it is worth reading if you are interested in writing and in developing yourself as a writer. I would recommend this book. 3-star rating or no, I would recommend it. The last book that I read in December was James S.A. Corey's Leviathan Wakes. This is the first of a 9 or 10 book series called The Expanse, which has been made into a multi-season show on Amazon. It's a sci-fi, it's an epic sci-fi, it's a soft sci-fi, and that's important. So this is another book that was recommended to me. So my spouse recommended this to me, I would say probably a couple of years ago, and we have the whole series of books. They're actually on the top of this bookshelf that you see right here. But I hadn't gotten around to reading it because I was worried it was going to be a lot of like space politics, and that's not really for me. But it was not. So, the story. This is a story that is set in space at a time when humankind has colonized the moon, Mars, and the asteroid belt, but the stars are still outside of our reach. We haven't had any contact with aliens. It's just humans in the expanse. It's told in an alternating, close, limited third person with 2 main characters. There is James Holden. He is the XO of an ice mining ship called the Canterbury. And then there's Detective Miller, who is a cop on a space station named Ceres, and it's inside the asteroid belt. And he was born and grew up in the asteroid belt, whereas James Holden came from Earth before going out into space. So Holden's crew receives an SOS call, and they find an abandoned ship. And on that abandoned ship, they find a secret that someone out there is willing to do anything, including kill millions of people, in order to protect. Detective Miller has been tasked with finding a missing girl, the daughter of a rich Earth family, who has aligned herself with the rebel forces in the asteroid belt, known as the OPA, the Outer Planetary Alliance. And so he's following her trail, and following it leads him to James Holden, and the 2 of them end up at the center of what is looking like it's going to be an interplanetary war between Earth, Mars, and the asteroid belt, unless they can figure out a way to stop it. So some spoiler-free thoughts about this book. I really enjoyed it. My spouse, like I said, pushed me to read it for a long time, but space, politics, hard sci-fi, I had a lot of preconceptions about what would be in the book, and I was wrong. I was really wrong. I was very pleasantly surprised by how character-driven the narrative was and how fond I became of the characters, and that there was almost 0 sci-fi tech babble to slog through. That made it perfect for me. At line level, I think the writing is not the kind of beautiful that lends itself to pulling out a bunch of quotes. Holden and Miller have very distinct narrative voices and styles of storytelling, and the writing is smart, and it's quippy, and it's engaging. The author really understands the characters, and it shows throughout the narrative in subtle and unexpected ways. And it does have some horror elements, too, that work super well. I think that the author really blends genres and settings very well in this story. There's noir, mystery, detective story, and then there's this horror story, and then there's also this adventure story. The characters themselves are great. Holden and his crew are entertaining, they're endearing. They're not a military ship, but 2 of the members do have military backgrounds. But the way that they adopt a structure and a hierarchy is really interesting, and how they develop the dynamics of the crew over the course of the book is really fun and fascinating. Miller, the detective, especially towards the end of the story, was a little less my style. He's got this like noir, edgy, emo kind of vibe going on, and as a goth-leaning post-goth, you would think that would be right up my alley, but not this time. I did find him compelling. I enjoyed him a lot, but I wouldn't say that I loved him. As for the story, it moves. There are a ton of political tensions that arise as a side effect of what the main characters are doing, but since neither of the main characters are involved in the actual politics, it's something that's sort of shown in the periphery of the story. But it's done in a way that feels very real, right? You and I are not involved in the world politics that's happening right now. So we hear about it through the news, and from people talking and things like that. And that's what the characters in this story do. And that felt very relatable and very topical. The story events and the internal character arcs are also really well aligned. It's very satisfying, and the ending feels earned, which is something that I really need out of an adventure story like this one. Overall, I would give this book 4 stars. It's not going to get that 5th star because it is missing that language piece that really matters to me, but it is engaging, it's tense, it's immersive. I had to stop reading and pace a couple of times because I was getting really stressed out. So I'm going to give it a very strong 4. This book tackles themes of family, such as found family, as well as group identity and tribalism, and belonging on a broader scale. It talks about the nature of humanity, people as symbols, hubris, personal justice versus legal justice, and grief. Some content warnings for the book to keep in mind would be death, war, grief and grieving, body horror, gore, violence, suicidal thoughts, and alcoholism. Okay, spoilers. The story was really well paced from the beginning. The authors used a lot of really smart tricks to help keep the reader engaged, through the POV switches with the progression of the story. However, I do think there was a sense of dragging that happened in the latter half of the story. After Holden and Miller and the crew returned to Tycho Station after their confrontation with, I think his name was Dresden, the head researcher behind the proto-molecule and the architect of the nightmare on Eros. I think that part was dragging a little bit, and I think for me the reason that it felt like it was slowing down was because Holden and Miller had this falling out, and that's personally hard for me. I don't like it when characters are fighting amongst themselves, and because it felt like we had done what we can do with the characters, and I didn't really see how the story could progress in a way that would give them more to do. And there were still like 100 pages left to go, and I was like, something else is going to go wrong, but what is it going to be, and how are they going to get there? And it was just that moment of lull before that final kick of action that took me a moment to get through. I do think that the final climax made up for it, but there was a moment. As for the climax of the book, I was really sad to see Miller go. He wasn't my favorite, but I did like him. So I felt that his passing maybe didn't get as much pow, as much fanfare as I wanted. The story alternates POVs. So we're in Miller's POV, he makes the decision, and then we're in Holden's POV, and then the moment when Miller passes happens while we're looking through Holden's eyes. And maybe it's because of the little falling out that the two characters had that the moment lacked a little bit of the gut punch that I was hoping for. By contrast, I felt when the Canterbury was destroyed, that moment had a lot more emotional impact on me than when Miller passed because of the POV and the relationships and how they had been developed up until that point. But that was hard. But still, the ending made a lot of sense, and I thought it was handled very well. I would absolutely read the next book in the series. Actually, I'm planning on it in the next month. I have a hard time with series where if it's sort of like an expanded universe type thing where we follow one character in one book and then another character in another book and then a third character in the third book, I tend to lose interest. I like to follow one character throughout the course of an entire series. So when my spouse reassured me that Holden and his crew are central to the remainder of the narrative, that was really good for me. If they weren't, I'd probably still want to read the rest of the series, but it wouldn't necessarily be at the top of my TBR, and I would probably put it off for another couple of years before I get to it, just being honest. But either way, 4 out of 5 stars. Great sci-fi book, especially if you are not a hard sci-fi person. This is a book that combines genres very well, so there's stuff in here to like, even if you're not a sci-fi person. And that's the end of my December wrap-up. For January and 2025 in general, I have lots of plans. I thought I would share those with you now. So to start the year off, I am doing the StoryGraph January Reading Challenge, which is a 31-day reading challenge. Also, I am on StoryGraph, so if you are too, please follow me. I'll follow you. We can be buddies. And I am planning on reading 4 books this month. The first of which is The War of Art. This is by Stephen Pressfield, who I believe wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance, which is not one that I have read, but it was popular enough they made it a movie, so he must know something. This is a book which talks about the different blocks that present themselves to artists, writers, or creatives, and how to identify them and how to overcome them. The idea is that there is this force called resistance, right? It is the thing inside of us that makes us want to do anything other than the thing we want to do, right? So if you think to yourself, I'm going to sit down and write, but first I'm going to scroll through Twitter for an hour, then this book might be for you. I have yet to finish it, so I will give my full thoughts on that later. The second book that I'm planning on reading is Lisa Gardner's The Neighbor. This is the third book in the Detective D.D. Warren series. I've not read the first two, but from what I understand, you don't need to. I found this book in my little free library raid that I did in December. It was a little impromptu tour of some little free libraries in one of the small towns not too far from where I live. And I picked it up. I hadn't really never heard of Lisa Gardner, but it's a thriller. There's a murder. I'm into it. The third book on my January TBR list is DIY MFA. This is by Gabriela Pereira, who actually has a whole website, DIYMFA.com. This was recommended to me by a friend who writes, who said that it was a great way to sort of learn about and develop the skills that one would learn while doing a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing without actually going through the process of the degree, which can be hard for some of us. I thought it would be interesting. I am doing a writing series coming up called Iterating the Process, and from what I understand, this book deals a lot with iteration and process, so right up my alley. We'll try to knock this one out early on in the month if we can. But aside from that, I don't really know much about it, so we'll see how it goes. And the fourth book that I am absolutely planning on getting to is James S.A. Corey's Caliban's War. This is the second book of the Expanse series. I have no idea what happens in it. I am not reading the back cover. I do not want to know. I do not want to know. I'm just going to read it and hopefully be as pleasantly surprised with book 2 of the series as I was with the first. After I've read those books, if there's still time left in the month, I have 3 books that I've picked for my stretch goals list. The first would be All Fours by Miranda July. This was praised by George Saunders, who I love. I've seen some YouTubers talking about it, and they seem to have good things to say. It's about an artist who decides to do a cross-country trip, and she leaves her husband and her child at home and goes off on this road trip. And maybe like half an hour into driving, she decides to be spontaneous and sort of changes all of her plans. It's about a journey of self-discovery for a woman in her 40s who has an established career and a family, but still feels like she needs to find herself. According to the jacket, it transcends expectations. I will confess that my expectations are not as high as perhaps they should be. I am not a huge fan of the abandon your family to find yourself trope, but we'll see how that's executed in this book, considering that many people have found that they enjoyed it quite a bit. So that's the first book on the stretch goal list. The next book on my stretch goal list is The Successful Novelist by David Morrell. This author, I believe he wrote Rambo. I'm not sure, but I believe he wrote Rambo. Now, I confess, I started reading this book, I'd say maybe like 10 or 12 years ago, and I got to like the first bit of sage advice and found it really interesting. So I was like, let me try this. And so I put the book down and I went over to my novel and I started using the technique and found it so helpful that I just kept going with the novel and I never finished the book. So I plan on finishing it this time. This one's also going to be in my Books for Writers wrap-up series that I'm going to be doing. Not series, post? I don't know. We'll see how that goes later on in the year, so look out for that one. And the last book on my January stretch goal TBR list is The Kiss Curse by Erin Sterling. So I got this book when I went to visit a friend of mine in Wisconsin last year. We went to a pop-up romance bookstore called The Well-Read Damsel, and it was a little picked over by the time we got there. I think we might have spent an hour there, and we got there quite a while after they had opened. But I did find concept of this book very interesting. It's got sort of You've Got Mail vibes. There's a character, Gwyn Jones, who runs a magic or a witch supply store in a small town called Something Wicked, and a new person, Wells Penhallow, moves to town from Wales, and he opens up a new shop across the street. So it's got this like rival competing magic store shop vibe to it. It's a romance, so I'm sure there's going to be a kiss and a happily ever after, which a girl needs right about this time of year. So that's the last book on my January TBR stretch goal list. Overall, for 2025, I have a couple of goals that kind of feed into one another. The first of which is I want to read the books that I own. There are a lot of books on my bookshelves that I have not gotten to yet that were either gifted to me or books that I got from the little free library raid that I did in December, or books that I have purchased on impulse and have not gotten around to. So I want to read those. The second goal is to buy only the books that I have read and loved, so no more impulse purchases. And then the third is to go to the library more often. So read more library books, spend some time at the library, really support my local library. So those three kind of all go together. My provisional reading goal for the year is to read 24 books, which comes out to an average of 2 books per month. I am expecting to meet that fairly quickly, so I have set some stretch goals for 40 books and then 52 books. Like I said, I am a little bit of a slow reader, so I'm not anticipating going too much past that, but if I do, then I'll make more goals at that time. But I'm not trying to put much pressure onto myself to read a whole bunch of books. Slow readers, welcome. You are right at home right here. As for the channel, I do have some goals that I wanted to share as well. I started this channel in late November, early December, and so this will be my first full year on YouTube. So I'm planning on trying to create a consistent posting schedule, 3 posts per month for sure. And those posts will vary between my different areas of interest, so reading, writing, bullet journaling, and crafting any other subjects that I'm interested in, but primarily those 3. And I really want to make sure that I'm posting regularly and trying to increase the quality of the videos that I share every time, something new. This is actually the second time that I'm recording this video because the first time my sound really failed. So hopefully the sound turns out well on this version, and you can count that as the thing that I've improved for this video in particular. I'm also considering doing some deep dives for books that I particularly loved after reading. And I have a video, or maybe series to be determined, about books on writing or being a writer for writers. And that's about all the specific goals that I have. Mostly what I want to do is post videos regularly, increase the quality of my content, and get to know other people in the AuthorTube and BookTube space in order to build a comfy, cozy little corner of the internet where we can kind of practice some escapism when the world is a little bit tough out there. I know it's hard to say, let's have a good year, really lightheartedly like that, considering all the horrible things that are happening out there in the world right now. But I do hope that it can be a good year for us on a personal or individual level, in spite of all of that. I know that the things that I talk about on this channel are pretty mundane, but I hope that that can be a source of comfort for you. So I hope to see you back here again. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I look forward to seeing what your plans are for January and for the year ahead, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.